It started with disbelief, not from the media, not from lawyers, but from the jury pool itself. A courtroom in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the city of power, politics, and press. And at the center of it all, a man accused of something no one saw coming. Not espionage, not fraud, not corruption. A sandwich. The case was real, federal, filed, and moving forward, despite everyone's confusion. Sean Dunn, a D.C. man and former employee of the Justice Department, stood accused of assaulting a federal officer. His alleged weapon? A sub-sandwich. On paper, it looked ridiculous. But in a federal courtroom, it was dead serious. Prosecutors said it was simple. Early August, Dunn got into a heated argument with a group of Customs and Border Protection, CBP, officers near a government building. He yelled. He cursed. And then, he threw his sandwich. The officers claimed it was an attack. Dunn said it was frustrating. A tossed sandwich, not a crime. But the Justice Department saw it differently. They charged him with misdemeanor assault on a federal officer, a charge that carried up to a year in prison. And that was after the grand jury refused to approve a far more serious charge, one that could have sent him to prison for nearly 10 years. Inside D.C., people couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? A trial over a sub-sandwich? When the jury selection began, that disbelief spilled into the courtroom. 8 potential jurors, citizens called to serve, were dismissed. But not before they spoke their minds. One woman turned to CNN reporters in the hallway and said flatly, "How is that an assault?" Another added, almost laughing, "There's other stuff happening in this city. And this is what they're prosecuting." The frustration didn't stop there. A man who was also dismissed shook his head. Didn't he already lose his job? What's the point? He wasn't wrong. Dunn had already been fired from the Justice Department, his career erased within days of the incident. The decision wasn't quiet. It was public. Even Attorney General Pam Bondi, then one of the most visible justice officials, confirmed Dunn's termination. His name was already out there. His reputation already gone. But for the government, it wasn't enough. They said it was about accountability, respect for authority, law and order. Dunn's alleged words and actions that August day, prosecutors claimed, showed disrespect toward law enforcement and a willful act of aggression. And the sandwich. They said it wasn't funny. It was evidence. For the potential jurors, though, it was absurd. "I don't know how a D.C. jury would convict," one woman told CNN, walking away from the courthouse. The statement summed up the entire mood of the city. Because while Washington was drowning in political drama, corruption cases, and high-profile investigations, federal prosecutors were dedicating resources to this. The charge itself came months after the actual incident. The grand jury had already rejected the idea that Dunn's act constituted a serious assault. So instead, prosecutors went for the lesser charge. A complaint that carried a 1-year maximum sentence. On paper, it looked more reasonable. But to the public, it still felt like a joke. "Assault by sandwich," read one local headline. Cable news picked it up within hours. Talk radio hosts mocked it on air. Hashtags began trending. Hashtag subtrial. Hashtag justice for lunch. Hashtag throwing charges. But for Dunn, it wasn't funny. He was facing real consequences. Federal trial. Possible jail time. And a permanent criminal record, all over something he insisted wasn't meant as violence. According to court documents, the confrontation unfolded outside a downtown D.C. building in early August. Dunn allegedly yelled at a group of uniformed CBP officers. Witnesses said he used offensive language. Then, he threw a sandwich. It struck one officer in the chest, and Dunn ran. The officers chased him. He was caught, and later charged. Prosecutors called it an assault on a federal officer, a serious claim. But defense attorneys said it was ridiculous, that it was a moment of frustration, not a criminal act, and that the system's reaction, firing, charging, public shaming, was punishment enough. In D.C., the case became a symbol, a story that said more about bureaucracy and overreach than about one man's temper. People whispered about it in coffee shops and offices near the Capitol. "How is this even real?" they asked. "Who's paying for this? Why is this even in federal court?" It didn't help that the country was in the middle of a government shutdown. Agencies were paralyzed, federal employees unpaid, citizens angry, and yet resources were being spent on this case. "The government is wasting people's time," said one potential juror as she left the courthouse, "especially during a shutdown." Her words hit like truth. But for prosecutors, optics didn't matter. They saw a principle, an attack, no matter how small, on a federal officer. If that line wasn't enforced, they said, where would it end? The courtroom was tense. The stakes, surreal. Outside, cameras gathered. Journalists waited. People joked. But inside, the trial moved forward. Opening statements were short. The tone, serious. The judge, unimpressed by the laughter echoing outside. Dunn sat quietly beside his attorney. Dark suit, head down, expression unreadable. Reporters described him as calm, but tense. He had nothing left to lose. A year earlier, he had been a Justice Department employee. Now, he was the defendant in a Justice Department case. The irony was thick. During breaks, observers could hear jurors whispering to each other. Some smirked. Others seemed confused. One courtroom reporter tweeted, "You can feel the disbelief in the air. The jurors don't seem angry, they seem baffled." Prosecutors presented their evidence. Photos of the sandwich. Statements from officers. A description of how it hit one of them in the chest. They described the sandwich, approximately 6 inches, with meat and vegetables, as a projectile. One officer testified, "I felt something hit me. I looked down. It was the sandwich. He threw it intentionally." The defense had only one argument: this wasn't assault. There was no injury, no sustained contact, no intent to harm. Just anger and a flying sandwich. They emphasized that the officer wasn't hurt, never sought medical attention, and admitted to wiping off his uniform and returning to duty. But prosecutors pushed the law's letter. The federal definition of assault didn't require injury, only intentional physical contact in a threatening manner. That, they said, was enough. The defense countered, if that's the bar, then every tossed item in frustration could be a federal crime. A spilled coffee, a dropped bag, a bad day turned into prosecution. The tension in the courtroom was strange, equal parts comedy and tragedy. Outside, the story went viral. Clips of analysts debating it hit YouTube and TikTok. Comment sections exploded. "This can't be real. Only in D.C. Dude threw a sandwich and lost his career." But behind the memes and laughter was a real man's life unraveling. Sean Dunn's friends said he was spiraling. He had spent years working in government service. No criminal record. No violent past. And suddenly, he was the face of federal overreach. Journalists dug deeper. They found that Dunn's firing had been almost immediate, within 48 hours of the incident. No hearing. No appeal. Attorney General Pam Bondi had even made a public statement, emphasizing that violence of any kind toward law enforcement will not be tolerated. It was meant to sound strong, but it made the case sound bigger than it was. And now, with the trial underway, the entire city was watching to see if the system would double down. Legal analysts were divided. Some said prosecutors had no choice, the law was the law. By day 2 of testimony, the jurors' faces were stone. The laughter was gone. The reality had set in. If they convicted Dunn, they'd be labeling a sandwich thrower a criminal. If they acquitted him, they'd be undermining law enforcement. Either way, the message would echo far beyond that small courtroom. Dunn didn't testify. His lawyer said there was nothing more to say. The video evidence, limited, blurry, showed him walking away after the throw. No weapon. No chase. Just anger and regret. On the final morning of testimony, the judge addressed the courtroom. "We are not here to mock the law. We are here to interpret it." It was a quiet warning to everyone in the gallery. Laughter or not, this was still justice. Outside, protesters began to appear. Some carried homemade signs. "Justice needs common sense. Don't criminalize emotion." He threw a sandwich, not a punch. Tourists stopped to take pictures. Reporters interviewed bystanders. The case was turning from absurd to symbolic. By Monday afternoon, a jury was selected. 12 people, D.C. residents, ready to decide whether a man's moment of frustration was a crime. CNN reporters caught several dismissed jurors outside afterward. They all said the same thing. "I don't think any D.C. jury would convict him." The trial would begin the next morning. And as the courthouse emptied that evening, D.C. buzzed with quiet fascination. A trial that started with laughter was now a test of the justice system's limits. Outside, the streetlights glowed over Pennsylvania Avenue. Cameras packed up. Reporters made their final calls. Sean Dunn left the courthouse quietly, avoiding questions. His face was calm, but his future, uncertain. The world had already judged him. Now it was the jury's turn. And in a city full of scandals, power and corruption, the question echoing through D.C. was simple. Can you really call it assault, if it's just a sandwich? Morning light over Washington, D.C. The air is cold. The streets are quiet. But inside the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse, tension was already brewing. This was it. The first day of testimony. The trial of Sean Dunn, the man accused of assaulting a federal officer with a sandwich. Outside, cameras lined the sidewalk. Reporters rehearsed their intros. Producers whispered into earpieces. You could feel it, the strange electricity of a story that felt both serious and surreal. Inside the courtroom, Dunn sat at the defense table, jaw clenched, eyes forward. His lawyer shuffled papers beside him, calm but coiled. Across the room, 3 federal prosecutors prepared to make their opening statement. They stood under the seal of the Department of Justice, a symbol Dunn used to work for, and now was being prosecuted by. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In the gallery, a mix of journalists, federal employees, and curious locals filled the seats. Some looked angry. Some looked amused. Most looked confused. Because no matter how many times you said it, it still sounded absurd. The prosecutor began. Her voice, sharp, formal, deliberate. "This is not about a sandwich," she said. "This is about respect. About the rule of law. About the idea that no one, not even a government employee, is above it." The room went quiet. Every eye turned toward Dunn. He didn't move. Didn't blink. But his lawyer, a tall man in a dark gray suit, scribbled a note and slid it across the table. Dunn read it, nodded once. When the defense spoke, the tone shifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," his attorney began, "this case is exactly about a sandwich." He let the silence hang. Some jurors smiled faintly. "My client didn't throw a rock. He didn't throw a punch. He threw a sandwich, after being yelled at, cursed at, and humiliated in public." He paused again. "If that's assault, then every American having a bad day is one bad lunch away from a federal conviction." The jurors leaned back. One crossed her arms. Another shook his head slightly. It wasn't sympathy, it was skepticism. They were trying to understand how something so small had become something so serious. The prosecution called its first witness, a Customs and Border Protection officer, one of 3 who were present during the altercation. He wore his full uniform in court. His voice was firm. His story, simple. He said Dunn approached their group near a government building on a hot August afternoon. He appeared angry. He was ranting about something political, though the officer couldn't recall exactly what. Then, the officer said, Dunn threw his sandwich. It hit him square in the chest. The prosecutor asked if he felt threatened. The officer hesitated. I was surprised, he said. It's not something you expect. He was angry. You just don't know what comes next. It was honest. It wasn't dramatic. But it gave the prosecution what it needed: intent. The defense cross-examined immediately. Officer, did you sustain any injuries? No. Did you need medical attention? No. Did Mr. Dunn have any weapon other than the sandwich? No. Was the sandwich heavy? No. Did you see any sign that he intended to cause you bodily harm? I can't say for sure. The defense smiled. That hesitation, it mattered. Then came the second officer. His story was slightly different. He said Dunn had yelled something offensive about authority. He threw the sandwich, shouted, and ran. When asked if Dunn was armed, the officer said no. When asked if he pursued, he said yes, but only briefly. When asked if Dunn resisted arrest, he said no. By the end of the second day, it was clear. There was no dispute that Dunn threw the sandwich. The question was why, and whether it was really assault. And that's where the law got murky. In D.C., assaulting a federal officer doesn't require injury. It only requires intentional contact in a manner likely to cause harm or offend. That phrase, or offend, was key. It meant the government didn't have to prove violence, just disrespect. And that made people uneasy. Because if disrespect could be criminalized, where did frustration fit? Where did anger fit? Where did being human fit? On social media, the case was already being dissected in real time. Legal podcasts covered it live. YouTubers mocked it with titles like The Sandwich That Went to Court and Subway to Justice. Memes flooded X and Reddit. But some users saw something deeper. This isn't funny. This is about power. When the government decides who's allowed to be angry. By day 3, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. The laughter stopped. The fatigue set in. Reporters described the jurors as visibly disinterested. They'd heard about bread, lettuce, and tomato for hours. But beneath the absurdity, the stakes remained high. If Dunn was convicted, it meant a precedent that any physical act, no matter how harmless, could count as assault if directed at authority. And that terrified civil rights lawyers watching from afar. That afternoon, Dunn's attorney called a surprise witness, a bystander who saw the incident. Her name wasn't released publicly, but her words were sharp. She said she saw the confrontation. She saw the sandwich fly. She said it looked like a moment of anger, not an attack. He didn't look like he wanted to hurt anybody, she said. He just looked fed up. That line hit like the truth. By the time the defense rested, it was clear the case had become about something bigger. Respect, power, punishment, proportion. A sandwich had become a symbol of how far the government was willing to go to prove a point. Closing arguments began the next morning. The prosecutor spoke first. If we start excusing aggression because the object seems small, we excuse disrespect for law enforcement. We erode order. This wasn't about bread. It was about contempt. She paused. Let the words linger. Then added, intent matters. And Mr. Dunn made his intent clear when he threw that sandwich and fled. Then came the defense. He walked to the jury box slowly, took a deep breath. My client isn't perfect, he began. He lost his temper. He acted childish. But what he didn't do was commit a crime. He turned toward Dunn, then back to the jury. He's lost his job, his name, his future. For what? For a sandwich. He pointed toward the prosecution table. This case isn't about respect. It's about revenge. The government didn't like that one of their own embarrassed them, so they made an example of him. He stopped. The room went silent. If we can't tell the difference between disrespect and danger, then maybe the system needs to look in the mirror. When he sat down, even the judge looked moved. The arguments were over. Now it was up to the jury. They deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours over a 6-inch sub. Outside, reporters huddled on the steps. Commentators speculated. Protesters chanted quietly behind barricades. Justice needs common sense. Not every anger is a crime. Inside, Dunn sat still, hands clasped, waiting for the knock on the door. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was full. Every seat, every camera, every breath held. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." It was over. Just like that. A sigh rippled through the room. Some smiled. Some shook their heads. Others simply looked relieved. Dunn didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Then he looked up, exhaled, and whispered something only his lawyer could hear. He was free. Outside, the reporters descended immediately. Microphones, flashes, questions. "Sean, how do you feel? Do you think justice was served? What do you say to those who think this was a waste of time?" He didn't answer, just kept walking. That night, the news broke nationwide. Sandwich thrower acquitted. D.C. jury rejects federal assault charge. Justice served, with extra mayo. It was equal parts comedy and relief. But under the headlines, a serious conversation had begun. Legal analysts said it exposed a growing issue: overcharging. A system that stretched the law to prove its power, even when common sense said otherwise. If a sandwich could become a weapon, what couldn't? Dunn disappeared from the spotlight soon after. No interviews. No statements. No book deals. Friends said he wanted nothing to do with fame. He just wanted his life back. But it wouldn't be easy. He was still the man who threw the sandwich. The man the Justice Department fired. The man the nation laughed at. Months later, during an interview, one of the dismissed jurors was asked if she thought the trial had been fair. She sighed. Fair? Maybe legally, but not morally. He shouldn't have been in that courtroom to begin with. Her words went viral. Across D.C., the case left a strange legacy. Law students studied it. Podcasts analyzed it. Professors debated it. Was it justice? Or has bureaucracy gone mad? No one agreed. But what everyone remembered was the feeling, the absurd weight of a system that could turn a sandwich into a symbol. And somewhere in that irony, there was a quiet truth, that in a city built on power and politics, sometimes the smallest acts reveal the biggest flaws. Months after the verdict, the officer who had been hit with the sandwich was asked how he felt about it all. He paused, smiled awkwardly. "Honestly," he said, "it was just a sandwich. In the end, that was all it ever was. A sandwich. A man. A system desperate to prove it was in control. And a city forced to ask itself one simple question. When did justice stop having common sense?"